So I want to tell you about a movie that I saw a number of years ago, and I would love to show you clips from this movie, but in order to make my point, and there are good clips to show, I will at some point. The movie's called Crash. But in order to make my point, I would have to show you the entire movie because it has this sort of odd way of telling a story. It starts out with not like two characters or three characters that are the main characters, and you sort of track through a portion of their life. You start out with 10 or 12 or 14 characters, different characters with different storylines, and it's just jumping all over the place. You get a little bit about this person over here, you get a little bit about that person over there, and it's all over the place. I remember watching this with John Kern for the first time, and about halfway through the movie, John said, "Do you have any idea what's going on?" I said, I don't know, but I like it. He said, "So do I." But we could not figure it out. Absolutely could not figure out where in the world this was going. And eventually, all of these threads, I guess that's the best way to put it, all of these threads start weaving together, and they converge into this one gigantic point where all these lives, as the movie says, crash together. And as I was working on this sermon, I discovered that there's actually a name for that. It's called horizontal storytelling, where you just have all this stuff out there and you bring it all together. And of course, as a storyteller myself, I'm like in awe of that. This is somebody who really knows what they're doing. You almost have to work backwards. You have to know where you're going to end and then just spread it out backwards that way so it tells back this way. And I thought about that as I thought about what I was going to say to you today, because I want to talk, and actually my sermon series is going to be on this. It's the question that everyone seems to ask when they talk to their pastor, in one way, shape, or form. What is God's plan for my life? Everybody wants to know that, and I think when we ask that question, we expect a certain kind of answer. We expect the storyline more like Finding Nemo than Crash. Finding Nemo, you kind of know what's going to go on. Dad and son are together, son gets lost, dad goes out to find him, and you know the end of the movie, but getting there is a lot of fun, right? And there's this theme that runs all throughout, but it starts with the boy and his father being separated, and the boy is lost, and the father is going to come home. And I think when it comes to God's purpose in life, we'd like our lives to sort of map itself out so that it's got some kind of logical plan to it, and you can sort of track the progress. And of course, that would be fine if we were in charge. But we're not in charge of our storyline. Somebody else is. And, we could assign all kinds of grand schemes to whatever it is we're doing in life. But there's someone else in charge. And whatever grand scheme we might assign to our lives is just a tiny piece in a great big, gigantic puzzle. And each of us are threads moving towards this grand climactic thing that God has in mind for all of us. So you just heard the beginning of the story of the book of Exodus, and if ever there was a test or a case study in God's plan for our life, it's the book of Exodus. And now I'm going to do something linear here because I think it's important. I want you to understand what's happening. So it starts with God's people in slavery. That's where the book starts. And the story ends with God's people in freedom. But just those 2 chapters that were read, just so interesting because listen how he gets there. So God starts with people in slavery. He's going to get them to freedom. And in the middle, he knows that he has to have someone who is both a slave child and a prince of Egypt in order to make this freedom happen. Okay? And so we start the story. And we have a Pharaoh who is gone crazy with the idea that he might be overthrown. And so he starts putting people under hard slavery. And then when that doesn't work, he calls together these midwives, these two women, and he says to them, when the Hebrew women are about to give birth, if it's a boy, I want you to kill the boy right away. And the Hebrew women are God-fearing women, and they can't do that. And so they make up this story about the Hebrew women are just, they just give birth too fast. We can't get there in time to do your business. And then it goes further, and then we have the story focuses down on Moses' mother, who gives birth to this child. And she is afraid that the soldiers are going to come and kill her boy. And so she fashions a basket out of reeds. And she covers the basket with, basically it's some kind of tar, pitch is what it's called. And she lays him in the basket and she hides him in the reeds. And then she sends out her daughter, her name is Miriam, to watch the child, to see that the child's going to be okay. And then along the way, the Pharaoh's daughter happens to be out bathing in the river. You folks know this story. And she sees the basket, and she uncovers it, and she sees this child that's crying. She says, oh, this is one of the Hebrew babies. This is one of the kids that my father wants to kill. And then out of the bushes pops Miriam, the boy's sister. And she says, I can find someone to help you with this. And, of course, I'm going to guess that Pharaoh's daughter didn't just fall off the turnip truck. She knows who this is, and she says, go find someone who can nurse this child. And she brings back Moses' mom. And Moses is raised by his mother, and his sister, and the Pharaoh's own daughter. And of course, we're looking at the story in hindsight, and we know that all of these things have taken place so that God can put someone in the Pharaoh's house who is a prince of Egypt, who is also a slave child, so that eventually God's people will be freed from slavery. Right? But all three players in this, all four players in this, have no idea that that's what's going on. The two women, the midwives, they don't see the grand plan. What they see is an injustice. That children are being murdered because their king is crazy, out of control, paranoid. And so they fear God. They love God. And they make a decision to risk their lives to save a child. But that's all they see. They're just saving a child. Moses' mom and Moses' sister, same thing. All of them belong to God's family. Both of them belong to God's family. But all they're doing is they see their baby boy that they love. They see the baby brother that they care about. And so they put him in the reeds in the river. The Pharaoh's daughter, she sees the child. She takes the child. She knows if she just gives the child back to Miriam, she knows what's going to happen. He's going to be killed. And she knows that if she presents him to the Pharaoh, he's going to be killed. Instead, something happens, and she decides to protect the child because she knows that in the end, her old man is just wrong about this. And they had no idea whatsoever about God's greater plan. But God was using them, and I will tell you that if you take one thread out of that story and pull it out of the story, the whole thing collapses. Right? And so does Moses being called, because he's not there, by God to go back to Egypt to talk to the Pharaoh, the slave son who is a prince, and eventually to have those people let go, And now, because he's a slave son, he can lead those people with credibility because he's one of them so that they can go to freedom. They didn't see that one coming. Nobody saw that one coming. That was involved in the early part of the story. There's more. Because without those people going to freedom, there is no King Saul, no King Solomon, no King David. There is no nation of Israel. There is no promised land. There is no Jesus. And we are not sitting here this morning talking about another promised land. The promised land, that's the real promised land. Because you see, yeah, the promised land is a piece of real estate in Palestine, but it's much more than that. Much more than that. And the midwives couldn't see that. And Moses' mom couldn't see that. And Miriam couldn't see that. And the Pharaoh's daughter couldn't see that. All they saw was what was right before them at that moment. This is not a Finding Nemo story. Good as that story is. It's a story of threads. And God using each of those threads to bring them all together in the greatest story of all, the story of our salvation. Let's sing. Okay, let's shift gears here. I've got a story for you that I just found on the internet. It's a news story that came out in the last, 3 or 4 weeks. And you see if you can decide who or what I'm talking about. From the news story, it said it's about a company. It started in the 90s with a tiny upstart selling a single product category. But when it became clear that a sleepy, overpriced retail sector would crumble before it, there was nothing to stop this company from selling anything and everything. You could order from the comfort of your own home. You could pay a fair price. It would ship the goods directly to your door. Sales exploded. And if you picked up a big enough chunk of the stock when the company went public, you'd never have to work again. I knew you were going to say that. And if you think it's Amazon, you're wrong. It's not who it's talking about. Who? Sears and Roebuck. 1893, just about 100 years after Amazon. It's playing itself out again, right? You know what's happening to Sears this year? They're in the tank. They're fighting for their existence, and it's going to go away. Because, I think, they lost their focus. They lost who they were. They lost their sense of direction, and they became more interested in saving their institution than they did completing their purpose in life. that news article has been haunting me because I see so much of it in the church. I've been watching closely. This is the season for bishop selections in the ELCA. And I've been watching it closely, and there have been lots and lots of upsets. I will tell you that right now. Lots of bishops who didn't get their job back. Ours was one of them, right? And, you know, it's like people know that something is amiss. You can't lose 70 to 100,000 members a year and sustain that. We're bleeding. And so we've got this season of bishops' elections, and people are saying we've got to do something, and they start electing all these new people. And I hope and pray they haven't been drinking the same Kool-Aid as the ones they're replacing. But there's a really good chance they have been. I think about that when I think about my own ministry and this congregation. And, you know, I talk about it all the time, the way we need to change. But we're so caught up in the way we've always done things. And not just, I'm not talking about First Lutheran, I'm talking about us together, because I get caught in it too. And we can recognize the problem, but sometimes I just don't even know, we don't know which way to turn. We don't know where to go with this thing. And all of this came to a head this week when something happened here at First Lutheran. Something, you know, quite innocuous. So Shelley was working on putting the video together so it could go on the public channel. And she's doing that, and she's working through the files, and she said, "Pastor Dave, come here, I got to show you this." And Chelsea Krause's sermon got recorded. We thought it was lost because the equipment didn't work correctly. By some miracle, the sermon got recorded. And I thought, great, I'm going to get to hear this thing. So I quick rendered it and put it up on YouTube, and that was 3 days ago. And in 3 days' time, it's had, are you ready for this? 300 views with over 1,800 minutes of watch time. In 3 days' time. I'm more than a little jealous, okay? And, you know, I have to tell you, I know Chelsea. I've known her for a long time. I didn't see this one coming. I've known her for 19 years. And what I knew of her was that she was one of two twins, and they always dressed cute. Their mom dressed them up beautifully, and they were these two little dolls that walked around the church and ate donuts with us. And I didn't see it coming. She was in high school. She was in college. And if you were to ask Chelsea the same thing, and by the way, I don't know, those of you who were here, you heard the sermon? That was the first time she ever preached. The very first time. I'm jealous again because my first time preaching was an epic fail. I'll tell you about it sometime, but it was a disaster. And so if you were to ask Chelsea the same thing, how did you get here? She doesn't know herself. I know she doesn't. There are very few straight lines that led her to a place where she came to me and called one day and said, "God's laid something on my heart, and I need to say it. I need to speak it." And I listened to her sermon, and talk about threads. I hear shades of the things that I would say to her in my sermons. But it's all so different as well. And all I was doing was just nothing special. Just hauling myself up in the pulpit every week, and at that time reading from a manuscript, just doing our thing. I get down on my knee and say hi to kids as they go by, just kind of like what we always do around here. Nothing special. Pull that thread out, and it goes away. Chelsea's not sure how she got here because there were no straight lines. And in fact, as she talked about in her sermon, the path there was loaded with all kinds of trials and troubles and disappointments. And I will tell you, she was disappointed in herself in many cases. But it started before that with a relationship with God. And then, as those curves and twists and turns of her life started happening, she found herself, as she said in her sermon, not band-aiding it anymore, with cute phrases and ways to push it off to the side. But she found herself leaning into those troubles and those trials. And all of a sudden, the presence of God just exploded in front of her. Purpose and direction. And now she's sharing it with people that, if First Lutheran were left to just me, wouldn't have a chance of reaching them, because they're connecting with her trials and her troubles, and they're looking for a relationship with Jesus Christ, the kind of relationship that, as they lean into those twists and turns of life, he will appear for them as well. Let's sing. So let me ask you folks, what's God's purpose in your life? And if you don't know the answer to that, that's a really good start, I would say. A really good start. Because I will tell you that if you have a good idea of what that answer is, or you think you do, it's probably Sears and Roebuck thinking. I will tell you, and I believe this with all my heart, that the purpose in your life and the purpose in my life starts with a relationship with God. Because here's what happens. As you enter into that relationship, and as that relationship deepens, you will find a God who loves you unconditionally and will walk beside you and never, ever let you go. The word Exodus is a word that literally means the road out. We're starting here, and it starts with that relationship. And the rest of it is a windy, crazy, spiraling road that God will use for his own design. So when Linda, thank you, Linda, got up this morning and said, we need volunteers, it'll hit your ears. And the relationship that you have with God, a God who loves you, a God who walks beside you, who changes the very character of your life. And Linda stands up and she says, we need volunteers. And you might say, I'm too old for that. I'm too this. I'm too that. I don't have time. But there's a God who loves you. And there are children who need to hear. It's a call, isn't it? And you don't know where this is going. You don't know what you're going to run into when you walk into this place and there are like 250 kids here. Let's hope so. Let's not hope so. Let's make it happen. We got yard signs. Let's make it happen. Get a yard sign out. Stick it in a place where people drive by and they will see it. Talk to anybody you see about it. And you know, if that's all you do, there's a thread that God's using. And you pull that thread out, and that child that you talk to, that parent that you talk to, never gets in here, never hears, and God's kingdom is the less for it. It's not Finding Nemo. It's a whole bunch of threads, and your life is one of them. And then your thread will cross the life of another. And that thread is drawn in. And then that life, that thread, will cross the thread of another. And that life is drawn in. And all of a sudden, that promised land, that thing that God has set before Moses and his people, becomes not just a reality for them and not just a piece of real estate in Palestine, but it becomes an eternity of life and freedom and love from those who have not heard and do not know, but have experienced the slaveries of this world. Live with that promise. Know that relationship in your life. And then let your ears be opened so that you might be used in ways you never dreamed possible for God's good purpose. Amen.